Welcome, everyone. Jeff Jensen here, Director of Community Programs with Trees Forever. I'd like to welcome you to this wonderful Stewards of the Beautiful Land webinar with a great topic and an even better presenter. We have Tolif Hunt with University of Northern Iowa. A reminder that this will be recorded, and we'll go ahead and post this on our YouTube webpage, or channel, I should say, so that you'll be able to access it if you miss anything or if you know of others that wanted to attend but couldn't. Just a reminder to connect with us on Facebook. We have our Stewards of the Beautiful Land Facebook group, and so that's got some great pictures. I need to get a post up there, so I'll do that here this week because we also want to remind you that we have our last webinar coming up on the 27th, and this one is going to be another fantastic one. We're going to be talking about the last glacier in Iowa and the behavior and the landforms of that Des Moines lobe. That's where I live, the Prairie Pothole region here. And so we'll have Phil Kerr with us again. Phil's done such a great job in the past talking to us about geology. He's done some other presentations for us, and this one's going to be a really nice one as well. So don't miss that. Check out our events page on the Trees Forever website so that you can get registered and attend that. We have a couple of field days coming up. In fact, one today. So if you find yourself over in Carroll County, there's going to be a tree planting and a walk in the woods at Swan Lake State Park from 5:30 to 7:30. And then next week, we're going to be over in the Okoboji area at the Mazer Monarch Lodge in Dickinson County, again, 5:30 to 7:30. We'll be doing a prairie walk and a planting there. And then Thursday, the 21st, we'll be in Franklin County, the Mains Grove Lodge, another prairie walk and planting. And then a really great opportunity on Saturday, September 23rd, down at the Cedar Bluff State Preserve, starting at 10 in Mahaska County. Going to be doing some prairie planting, hand seeding. It's going to be a really great time. So if you find yourself in that neck of the woods, be sure to stop out and learn more. Well, without further ado, I'd like to introduce our distinguished presenter here today, Tolif Hunt with the University of Northern Iowa. He's going to be talking to us about managing natural and restored prairie. Actually, it had a much longer title, and I took the easy way out. But let's get your screen shared here, Tolif, and we'll get you underway.
Welcome, everyone. Thank you so much for having me. Thank you, Trees Forever, for inviting me to take up your lunch hour here on this glorious fall day here in Cedar Falls. At least use a little bit of rain, but you know, who's going to complain? I'd like to introduce myself just a little bit of my background. So again, I'm Tolif Hunt. I'm the Director of the Office of Research and Sponsored Programs here at University of Northern Iowa. That's my day job. By night, I am the instructor for one of the geography departments and majors here at UNI for environmental resource management. And it's always great to kind of get out of my paper pushing role here at University of Northern Iowa, sifting through contracts and research agreements, and get in front of students. So that's one of the funnest things I get to do every fall. My background, I've got a bachelor's degree in conservation biology and master's in environmental science and policy. A little bit of work history prior to working at the University of Northern Iowa. I was actually the director for White Rock Conservancy. We'll talk a little bit about White Rock Conservancy. If you haven't been there, make time to go to White Rock Conservancy over in Guthrie County, Iowa. Fabulous landscape, fabulous organization, founded by one of Iowa's good families, I would definitely say, in the Garst family. Also, right off, worked in Western Pennsylvania Conservancy. Briefly mention them as well, too. The Western Pennsylvania Conservancy is a land trust out in Western Pennsylvania, obviously, but based out of Pittsburgh. As you can see, my background is primarily in the agro-ecosystem area. I did my master's research on the use of cover crops on corn silage fields and trying to demonstrate the impact on soil quality that cover crops had and merge that with potential perceived negative impacts on silage production. So that was some of my formal training, and as I progressed through my career, I expanded that into more landscape ecosystems. So just so we're all on the same page, a couple introduction slides. I'm going to kind of mash these together throughout the entire presentation. But natural prairies, when I'm talking about natural prairies or remnant prairies, I'm really meaning remnant prairies. These are prairies that basically haven't been disturbed, have old and weathered soils generally, well-structured vegetation, and they're generally in these little odd places throughout the Iowa landscape. Here's a picture of one right here that this is actually on the White Rock Conservancy landscape, a remnant prairie that was just out of the reach of the spray booms when it used to be used as pasture, and it's kind of on you can see it's right on the edge of a pretty steep bank as well. Kind of a typical place where you might find a remnant prairie. Restored prairies, or these are prairies that probably have been under the plow at one point in time. Soils are probably a little less structured than maybe under a remnant. But this is one of those prairies where it has been restored. It could be 50 years old, it could be just 5 years old, but something that was planted by people and under a restoration regime of some sort. And then I'm going to talk about all the other grasslands. When I talk about other grasslands, I'm talking about the many open spaces that we have on the Iowa landscape, that such as old brome grass, grasslands, old CRP plantings, things like that. And I'm also going to be talking about a part that we don't often include in grasslands, pastures, right? So this goes from pastures that are managed for long grass grazing. You can typically see these in southern Iowa, typically where there's more grasslands, rolling landscapes, to grasslands that are a little bit more highly managed, like the one in the center of the screen there, to unfortunately grasslands that are probably a little more typical of many Iowa pastures, particularly in the glaciated areas that you see on the bottom there, that are probably overgrazed and in marginalized corners of the landscape. These are grasslands, right? They're open space. They are not under agricultural production as far as row crops go. And so when I'm talking about other grasslands, those are the types of things I'm referring to. So today, what we're going to look at is kind of a high-level management approach for multi-layered disturbances on the grassland system. I've never run a drip torch, although I've participated in many burns. I was always the guy with the tank on my back. I'm not talented enough to do a drip torch, apparently. But what we're not going to talk about is how to. This is going to be a little bit higher level. One thing I would also point out is when I'm talking about grasslands, I'm going to be talking about in general, right? So there's times when I'm talking about the grassland system or grassland landscape, I'm referring to your restored prairies, CRP, remnant prairies, those other grasslands, pastures, and maybe recreational landscapes where old CRP, things like that. This is a part of Iowa's grassland landscape. And I'm also going to be referring to both private and public lands. Right? We have grasslands that are in a lot of different ownership styles, and so I'm going to lump those together for now until a little bit later in the presentation when we talk a little bit about parcelization of ownership of grasslands. So I don't need to share this with probably most of the people on this webinar, but what a glorious thing 1850s, 1830s Iowa must have been. Peppered with wetlands, nothing but tallgrass prairie for as far as you can see, interrupted by your oak savanna, and then of course in the northeast more woodlands. This is something that I can only imagine, and when I do, it takes me a minute to snap out of it about what this landscape might have looked like as it was covered in that grassland biome many years ago. Today, of course, much different. These grasslands are now basically converted to cropland, as you can see in the kind of the gray etched area. Although in southern Iowa, we still have a lot of that grassland, that open space. And when I'm talking again about grasslands, I'm talking about that space that is used for something other than crop or industrial lands or population areas, rural, urban areas. I'm talking about the pastures, the old CRPs, the restored prairie, those remnant prairies as well. And obviously, a lot has changed, right? We are looking at grasslands, as I've described them, as opposed to row crop, in a fraction of what they once were. just to get you a few numbers. Now, these numbers are a little bit dated. I didn't have time to update this particular table, but I did look at some more recent land use data. The ratios are about the same. Grasslands are huge part of the landscape. When you think about the roughly 36 million acres we have in Iowa, just over 10, maybe closer to 11 million acres is in that grassland, ungrazed grassland, grazed grassland, CRP. So grasslands here in Iowa are a huge deal, right? I mean, they are a big part of the landscape. They were, of course, at one time a much bigger part of the landscape. But in terms of things like environmental quality, water quality, the things that we really appreciate and usually take for granted from grasslands, it's a big deal, right? And in particular in the southern tier counties of Iowa. What do we know about our grasslands? Well, they're diverse, right? You have remnant, you have restored prairies, like the one on the top right, left of your screen. We've got, as I had mentioned, other types of open grasslands, maybe cool season grass dominated, hunting lands. We've got pastures, right? We've got savanna, we've got rent. We also know that these grasslands are highly fragmented, particularly in the northern tier counties, but also in the southern tier counties as well. They're fragmented by land ownership, they're fragmented by urban areas, they're fragmented by management, right? But one thing that we can say for sure in Iowa is that most all grasslands, I would say, are under some kind of human management here in Iowa. There's some exceptions perhaps, but even in Los Hills and some other areas, but I think by and large, even those areas are under some human management regime. So what I'd like to first start out with is focusing on the functional state of these grasslands, right? Brian Oakey is someone that I stumbled across as I was doing my master's research, and I was really focusing on the agro-ecosystem. And Brian Oakey in '96 went through and sort of was trying to develop an agro-ecosystem farm level health indices. And what Brian did was he borrowed from some ecosystem health indices that are regularly used. Things like system stability, functional resiliency, sustainability, self-organization. And what Brian did was he borrowed these elements of ecosystem health criteria, and he added in a few things for the agro-ecosystem. In particular, at the bottom there, you see efficiency and socioeconomic. Now, these are part of an ecosystem health criteria as well, but they're particularly important if you think about an agro-ecosystem. So this is sort of my frame of reference, is when I'm looking at the health of the grasslands of Iowa, I'm looking at this framework. So obviously, we'll just run through these quickly. What is stability? Stability of an ecosystem, of any system, is that ability to sort of resist state changes, right? So you can have changes, but there's that system in its functional state is able to retain some level of stability in how it functions. It still functions as a grassland, even though perhaps some of its management has changed or a disturbance has taken place. Should have resilience. Resilience is that ability to reestablish its structure, right? Following a disturbance, it's able to recover in a reasonable time frame and once again become what its sort of natural functional state is. You can see a picture here of some straight line winds that have downed a huge swath of trees. Over time, if that system is resilient, that disturbance is not going to be altering to that functional state of the system. Sustainable, right? I think we all have a sense of sustainability, but I sort of separate out sustainability and resilience and some of the other terms as being over time, right? A sustainable system should be able to maintain its functional state over an indefinite period of time, right? Sort of regardless of the many changes that take place, that system, that functional state is able to be sustained. And this includes some elements, things like economic, social, management changes, environmental changes. It won't fluctuate too much and suddenly collapse as a system. Self-organization, a little bit more attuned to an agroecosystem, but uh, I would suggest that even grasslands, it's an agroecosystem in Iowa, even the restored prairies and other landscapes of similar structure. But self-organization is also a part of a healthy system. And I don't even need to speak to the importance of diversity and complexity. Diversity is a key indice of health of the system. And of course, with diversity, it underlays, your ability to the system's sustainability, the system's resilience. And so obviously higher diversity systems are going to be stronger in the functional state than those systems with lower diversity. And finally, the one that I think starts when we think about managing grasslands, including those that have been restructured, the productivity element, right? So here's a picture of a piece of land where you obviously have cattle grazing. You've got some solar panels off to the left, and these are landscapes and these are measures of the productivity. Now, here in Iowa, and I will come back to this, I think that it's really important to kind of keep this in mind as we speak to grassland management at a landscape level. So at the landscape level, I asked the question, is Brian Oakey's model, which was really developed more to look at a farmscape that would include cropland and include pasture and other types, isn't it appropriate sort of criteria for considering grassland management systems in Iowa? I would suggest yes, right? Because here in Iowa, even if you have a 40 or 100 acre, however big an area of a restored prairie or savanna, an area that is under sort of natural management, maybe perhaps managed with fire only, the human impact and the demand for productivity from any landscape, particularly in Iowa, which is dominated by an agricultural land use mindset, is impacted by people, right? And that productivity is really important. And this is one of the things that I will come back to periodically as we move forward, is how important it is to consider whether or not a land base is being productive. And in general, we're thinking about bushels per acre, animal units per acre, or whatever that productivity is. There is a measure, and it has a huge impact on our grasslands. And I want to say it's not the current management that's the issue. It's how we manage, right? Here in Iowa, we are in general an export state when it comes to many of our natural resources. And this impacts your system stability, right? We export a ton of biomass. We export a ton of carbon. We don't return enough back to our soils. We're not capturing enough in our soils and retaining it in our soils. We export soil, right? How much erosion and runoff is going into our creeks, streams, and eventually rivers. We're exporting water, right? Tiling is to me one of the most difficult human impacts to deal with, because it is so disruptive to the hydrologic regime of many of our landscapes, if not all of it. And we're exporting these resources. When you have that kind of impact throughout the entire landscape, you are impacting the stability, resiliency, sustainability, efficiency, diversity of an entire landscape. And I would say that not even the most pristine of restored prairies or protected remnant prairies is beyond touch from this reality of land in Iowa. There's other things going on, though, with the grassland resource base that I think are alarming and that really call for a retooling of how we look at management on grasslands, right? The amount of pasture, which we don't always typically put into grasslands or natural areas management, but pasture it's a grasslands, it's open space. Pasture here in Iowa is on a steep decline since the 1940s and 50s. That is continuing to decline, and it does not show any sign necessarily of recovery. Now, this is a little bit older. This is through 2012. But I can tell you right now that these are trends that have not necessarily subsided, and it's a downward trend. And so this is open space. This is grassland resource that's being converted to something else. Could be cropland, but it's also urban development and other uses along those lines. What else is going on with our grasslands? Well, our grasslands, in terms of looking at its health, its overall resilience at a greater level, you can see the CRP enrollments by year. So through 2022, you know, a little bit of rebound from like the days of 2014 or back when I worked with White Rock Conservancy before 2012, when there's a steep decline. But one thing that you can see here is a distinct correlation between high corn prices and low corn prices. CRP generally dips when the corn prices are high, and CRP enrollments when corn prices are low tends to go up. Not a new scenario, but you know, I think it's obvious. And you know, if you think back to, like, I was crop scouting back in the late 90s for DuPont, and that was during the heyday of $5 corn. Man, it was unimaginable back in the late 90s, $5 corn. And you can see where we were with some of the CRP acres and enrollments. So it is a correlation, and to me, this cycle speaks to the fragility of our grassland land base, right? So it is one of those things where we have to keep in mind the productive element of how we look at grassland management and management decisions. There's something else also going on that I think is calling for Iowans and in fact at a national level, of course, to rethink how we are looking at management of natural resources, and in particular management and protection of grasslands, and in particularly grasslands that have been restored, or you know, native prairie, things along these lines. And that is climate change. This is a major stressor that is having absolutely undoubtable impacts on the landscape. It is human influenced, and it is happening fast, right? So this is where the plant hardiness levels were. Note that Iowa was almost exclusively a Zone 5 state, and comfortably so. In fact, if you look at northern Missouri, after 2011, 2012, that plant hardiness zone, temperature zones are starting to change, and this is the pattern, right? So we have Zone 6 now is for all of the southern tier counties. Zone 5 is creeping northward. This is having an enormous impact on species, on pollinators, on sensitive species, birds, amphibians, other creatures, even plant species that have a range of tolerance that is now being tested, and it's happening in mere years or decades at the longest. And you're seeing these changes, and we can see it as we look around. It's not hard to find the changes. Well, this stressor of climate change, to me, is one of the main reasons why, in addition to all the other, the CRP sensitivities to corn prices, things like the decline in pasture, open space, and those types of things that are stressing our grasslands. Climate change is one of those things that I think is going to and should be taken into major consideration when we think about landscape level conservation of our grasslands. And in fact, to grab an example, I'll grab one from my old employer, Western Pennsylvania Conservancy, which is a land trust. Western Pennsylvania Conservancy, been around since the early 1900s, has as its bread and butter targeted sensitive species and sensitive ecotypes, wetlands. You know, they'll find rare amphibians or rare plants, and just like most land trusts, they identify those sensitive spots, and then they build around by purchasing land or protecting it with land easements. And they try to build around that sensitive species. Well, in conversations with Western Pennsylvania Conservancy leadership, over the past 2 years, they are starting to switch. They are starting to do something that I think is really revolutionary in that land trust field, and it's something that we need to take into consideration when we think about protecting prairies, restoring prairies, and protecting remnant prairie landscapes, as well as the greater grassland landscape itself. What Western Pennsylvania Conservancy is starting to do is they're starting to say, look, because of things like climate change and how fast that's happening, and how certain species that used to be keystone species within a sensitive area, the bog hopper, for example, is one species that is found at higher elevations in Pennsylvania, and it's, as you might guess, it's obligate to certain wetland types called bogs. It has no place to go, and it's so sensitive to its climate and its need for a specific area that you can't put a fence around it. You can't just buy a bog with this species in it and hope that it just stays the way it is and retains it is sustainable and resilient. And so what Western Pennsylvania Conservancy is doing is they are looking at things like diverse terrain. They're using resiliency testing. They're using soil types, geology, biogeography as ways to perhaps retool and rethink their land protection. And the idea behind it is focusing on adaptation and resilience as key drivers. And what they're really thinking is we have to conserve the stage. The idea being, if we start conserving landscapes that we know have a high level of flexibility and adaptability and are resilient, then as climate change forces species elsewhere, or plant species, any kind of species, what they might have is refuge. If you can, across a landscape, conserve the stage, right? So the stage being the place, and the actors sort of being the species, the bird species and others that may come and go and rely on those stages as this environment and the climate, things like hydrologic regimes, rainfall types, as those shift really much too fast to adapt to. So it's an interesting concept that I think could potentially and does actually fit well with our management and conservation decisions when we're thinking about grasslands. So what I think we need to do is we need to, from a conservation standpoint, move on from just protecting a prairie in a place on the map and start thinking much more broadly. Of course, these places, these one spots, these 10, 12, 40, 100-acre restored prairies, protected prairies, high diversity, high resilience. Yes, they are 100% important, and we can't lose sight of that. But what we might need to do, because of the other pressures on grasslands and because of things like climate change, we probably need to retool sort of our lens as well, much like Western Pennsylvania Conservancy is doing. And I think we might need to start thinking very broadly about moving to protecting the Iowa's grassland stage, right? So where are we going to protect, and how are we going to protect all of grasslands, or the majority of grasslands, and what do we protect about them that would allow for pollinators and other sensitive species, or even plant species or non-plant species, birds, whatever species you think, as the climate changes, as rainfall patterns change, as prevailing winds start to change because of all the things that are happening that are affiliated with climate change. How do we address that and take into account that, in addition to things like economic pressure, production pressure, and the many other things that we talked about? And I think we need to reframe our mindset and really think about protecting Iowa's grassland stage, which would encompass many different types of grasslands. And how do we do that? Well, a place to start, if we take the model of thinking about protecting that grassland stage, is to focus, yes, on things like diversity indices. Yes, sensitive species, these are a part of the consideration. But we might also look at things like soil type, ecoregion, the habitat type itself. whether or not a disturbance or its ability to rebound. So what is the site's resilience? What does that mean? Connectivity to other grasslands and other grassland types, right? These are things that are typically considered, but maybe not as strongly and as valued when we think about protecting grasslands and in particular prairie and prairie remnants when it comes to making those decisions. And of course, productivity, right? I think that can't be a lost site. What is this land producing? Now, I know that's kind of a trigger word in many cases when we come to prairie enthusiasts, and I think it triggers me, for goodness sakes, because I see a restored prairie and I see productivity beyond belief, right? Productivity in carbon sequestration, productivity in pollinator habitat, productivity in water quality. But unfortunately, we have to think also productivity in terms of money, right? What is that landscape doing in terms of economic returns or other socially valuable returns that are maybe not related to the ecology of the system? So where I think we start on this journey, if we're thinking about protecting the grassland stage, is by looking at its ecosystem function. And we get right back to this stability, resiliency, sustainability at the landscape level. And the idea here that I am presenting in the next 15 or so slides is the idea that key to the success of protecting the stage is restoring some of the disturbance regimes that are lost, right? Now that's not new necessarily, right? We understand that for any grassland to function, it requires certain types of disturbances, right? So we have grassland functional staples. We know fire, right? We absolutely know that fire is a huge part of it. If you look down to the lower left, lower right hand, sorry, grazing, right? We understand grazing. Now here's a picture of cattle grazing, but we understand the historical significance of bison and large ungulate species and their grazing impacts with their the type of grazing they do, the preferential grazing, hoof imprints, and soil aeration, right? We also know that there's some other disturbances that are common now that might have been a part of this, that sort of mimic some of the historical disturbance regimes. Things like mowing, right? I mean, if we know that grasslands, particularly in prairie restoration scenarios, you're going to have to mow, right? Especially in those early establishments periods to control weeds. And this is a different type of disturbance than, say, grazing, right? You're taking that, you're actually leaving the above ground biomass on the site, and it's all evenly cut. And so it's a type of disturbance that our grasslands respond to, right? And it's a human impact, of course. Grazing, on the other hand, is it's perhaps removing the biomass of the above ground. It's moving to another place, but it's coming back in other ways, right? It's coming back in poop and pee, and it might be moving around, but it's a different type of disturbance altogether. And then, of course, I have to give a shout out in the human complex here, of course, of managing grasslands. The Minnesota-Iowa Conservation Corps, Green Iowa AmeriCorps, other areas and other people, private landowners, are also mimicking on our landscape certain disturbances. And you can see a picture here of the Iowa-Minnesota Conservation Corps members who's just gone through and is doing some prairie restoration by removing woody species. This is also mimicking certain types of disturbances from browsers or windstorms and things like that would have occurred and that our grasslands depend on. So what kind of disturbances are we needing or missing to protect that grassland stage? Well, on our restored and remnant prairies here in Iowa, we've got a lot of them, right? We are actively doing things like mowing. Most of these landscapes, at least the ones that are in relatively healthy functional states, so high resilience, high sustainability levels, criteria, good diversity indices, they've got fire on them, right? Or they have somebody who's looking after them. It might not be the Iowa Minnesota Conservation Corps or something like that, but it's somebody who's looking after taking care of the woody species, right? And early establishment, or sometimes after a disturbance, you might have an outbreak of thistle in an area or something like that after a burn that maybe it got too hot. There's somebody with a mower to take care of it. These disturbances are on the landscape already. What about the other, right? The other landscape, the other grassland that's a vital part of the grassland stage, our prairies, or sorry, our pastures, right? There's just one disturbance that takes place on pastures, and that kind of production-based grassland landscape, and that's grazing, right? Sometimes, yes, if the county weed commissioner gives you a call, you jump out there with the mower and mow down the patch of thistle if you've had an overgraze event, something like that. But generally speaking, there's just one type of disturbance that's taking place on a very large component of the grassland stage here in Iowa. But what's missing? If we look at this as a whole, we know that a major part of the grassland stage are reconstructed prairies, remnant prairies, other protected lands. Yeah, I'll even speak to some of the hunting lands, you know, the old CRPs and savannas that are, they're generally missing if a grazing event from a large herbivore, right? They have grazing with meadow voles and rabbits and other types of species, but not like a large herbivore such as a bison or cattle, as the picture is showing here. And of course, you know, there's a major disturbance missing on all of our pasture lands as well, that being fire, right? So when I step back and think about that grassland stage, what else is perhaps missing? Well, we have done a wonderful job here in Iowa. Many land trusts and small organizations have also worked to think about the connectivity and protecting that landscape. Here's a map of Iowa Natural Heritage Foundation and some of their land protection sites. INHF, one of my favorite land trusts, awesome organization that protected literally tens of thousands of acres of prairie and savanna and many other sensitive landscapes. And here's a zoom in of just west of Ames and Des Moines and kind of in the area of White Rock Conservancy and Guthrie County, Carroll County. You can see an awful lot of land it has been protected by those little brown dots. But you can also see that there's no way that this land protection, without consideration of connecting points or connectivity of one type of landscape to the other, or one type of grassland to the other, we can't possibly protect the landscape and the stage at the level we need to through this type of protection only, right? We have to think a little bit more eco-regionally in many cases. You also know that what is missing here at the grassland stage level is, here's just a zoom in of Guthrie County, right? It's just a sectional map, a plat map, and I just circled kind of randomly. You can see in this landscape, there's cropland, there's clearly some open landscape, probably pasture or maybe CRP lands. You can see all this. But what we see here is ownership and management parcelization, right? So it's not just, INHF is out there protecting these wonderful places, and in between all of those wonderful places, those highly sensitive landscapes or restored grasslands or savanna, this is what exists. And what exists on this landscape is highly fractured in terms of the type of management. Some fire, some grazing, some both, sometimes, rarely. And you have some of these lands are just hunting lands, a vast array of different ownerships and different management types. And so this is one of those things of connectivity of management in particular on this landscape is one of those things that is missing, and perhaps challenging us for our, if you think about protecting that grassland stage. So what does this all mean for Iowa's grassland stage, right? Well, we know that basically at any given time, most of Iowa's grasslands are missing some diverse disturbance regimes, right? Usually you have all fire but nothing else, or it's all grazing but nothing else, or it's, you know, it's typically very rarely do we have fire and grazing taking place on one landscape, or some other some other combination of disturbance regimes. We know that these grasslands are highly fragmented, right? There's protected landscapes, but it's also more so those protected landscapes, those protected prairies. If you think about, you know, maybe CRP or an INHF protected landscape, or Nature Conservancy, some other landscape, those protected landscapes are fragmented in where they are on the map. But in between there, even these kind of supposedly connected landscapes of grasslands, particularly, you know, southern Iowa, I would say, these are fragmented by ownership. They're fragmented by management approach. They're fragmented by goals. They're fragmented in a lot of different ways. We also know that restored remnant prairies, they're diverse and healthy, but in a agroecosystem perspective, generally speaking, they're not productive, right? They're not creating a viable economic return unless maybe they're in CRP or something like that. But we know CRP, that's a tough one, right? It's on old cropland. If you can't have a restored prairie on any kind of land that doesn't have a cropping history, right? And so we have to think about that. There's a lack of productivity on some of these lands that maybe isn't the driving force, but is one of those really important considerations that we need to think about. And we know that those other grasslands, right? They lack resilience and sustainability, and it's because of the productivity, right? That's all they are being managed for, is to be productive at all times. So we can look, if we take a step back, at all of Iowa's grasslands, and I would say that even some of the best restored, most sustainable, diverse prairies are lacking some level of stability. They're lacking some level of resiliency because of the productivity element, right? We know that most of our pastures in Iowa are probably also lacking stability, resiliency, right? All we have to have is a drought, you know, a prolonged period with no rain, and if you're a grazer, you're looking for hay, right? Because the grass isn't growing and it's not in that vegetative stage, and you've got nowhere else to go, right? So these are the things that are impacting that Iowa's grassland stage that is really impacting its foundational stability, right? It's foundational and fundamental ability to resist, to be resilient and be sustainable. So what's the plan? I would like to say that one thing that we should be thinking about is, again, protect the stage by addressing all grasslands in our planning, right? I know it's easier said than done, but we might start taking a look at how we approach grassland management by looking at things like soils, topography, connectivity, you know, where it makes sense to link these types of various and current grassland types. Might think about inventory current grasslands' state of resilience, sustainability, efficiency, right? And use those to help guide our management decisions. Reintroduce certain types of disturbances onto landscapes that lack that type of disturbance, or reduce disturbance. So, you know, things that might jump to mind: reintroduce certain types of grazing to, you know, restored prairie, for example, and concurrently reduce disturbance on some of the grasslands that are serving as pastures that are really suffering in their ability to be resilient to climatic change because of the prolonged and single type of disturbance of grazing and production on that landscape. So what's the vision? The vision here is really, like I just said, starting to swap out and look at a landscape level, right? So where we have areas like pasture lands that are managed, how might we reintroduce certain types of disturbances onto that land, right? And vice versa, restored prairies, other types of highly diverse and otherwise stable native grasslands, reintroduce the the disturbance of grazing. I think that that's something, an area that we might start looking at. Now, before you say this guy's crazy, I would say I'm talking about certain types of, just a little caveat. I want to talk about certain types of grazing, right? I'm not talking about taking a herd of cattle and turning it onto a restored prairie and letting them hang out there for a summer, right? It's things like mob grazing, spot grazing. Maybe you only put younger cattle out there, or there's a lot of variability, and it would have to be site specific. But I just want to make sure everyone understands that I'm not promoting, turning a herd of cattle loose onto a restored prairie for 3 months and then hoping that that goes okay. It's definitely a prescribed type of grazing, right? With interior fencing and things like that. And as a reminder, when to graze, how much to graze, whether to burn, these types of things. These might also be driven by things like, your soil types, your habitat types. What types of disturbance are we trying to reintroduce to that landscape so that our protection efforts are helping to support an array, a stage of soil type, of habitats that are on a certain type of soil type, a stage of connectivity of grasslands that are in a certain level of functional health that are connected to each other, whether they're primarily prairie managed or primarily pasture managed. What kind of stage are we looking at? And also productivity, of course, right? I mentioned that. So I've actually been involved in some efforts to work on projects that looked at this as a reality, and a reality of that went across land management ownership and land management expectations. And this happened in 2010, 2011 when I was working with White Rock Conservancy. Again, a little shout out to White Rock Conservancy. If you haven't been there, this is kind of an older map of the Conservancy, but jump on their website, go pay a visit. Fantastic landscape, fantastic place. And in 2010 and 2011, we were actually the staff at White Rock Conservancy, and we're looking at this very, very closely, because we looked at that landscape of White Rock Conservancy and how we were managing it. We thought, there is something to this notion of the stage, right? So we have these different disturbance regimes that are taking place. Fire, of course, is on the White Rock landscape. Grazing is on the White Rock landscape. Cropping is on the White Rock. So there's a lot of different disturbances. How do we start managing this landscape and perhaps work with our neighbors and neighboring landscapes to improve the functional health of this land, right? So what we did is we had a project that was funded by a REAP-CEP grant, grazing as a management tool, and we got a diverse set of stakeholders together. Landowners, producers, cattle industry was represented, prairie restoration experts. There was quite an assemblage of individuals, and we got together for a 2-day summit and focus group style, and had conversations that some of us had never had before with each other. Cattlemen talking to prairie restoration experts, and private landowners who were restoring and taking care of their prairie and restored savannas, simply for the fact of what they give and to them as far as their expectations for ecological outcomes. And then we looked at things like focused on the grazing tool, building acceptance, pros, cons, barriers. So in my last few slides, I'll just go through kind of what happened. Well, the general consensus points were, grasslands management highly dissected. We talked about that. Pastures and prairies, these can be managed for mutual benefit, even if it's under different land ownership. You can have somebody who lives in the city who owns a 40-acre plot of land and they have pasture, they own CRP, that person can work with the local cattle operator to reintroduce certain types of just grazing disturbance. We also talked about, grazing, that's income. That addresses Oki's idea of whether or not we can have certain types of productivity associated with this type of landscape. We also talked about, what's the biggest threat. CRP is a big threat. Prairie grasslands, they need grazing, tons of uncertainty of what that looks like. But general agreement that grazing is a great economic tool for potential protection and stability of that grassland landscape. There's many challenges. I'm getting a little short on time here, so I'll skip through this, but what's the best time to graze? Is that the worst time ecologically? Some ideas that were tossed out for, hey, where could we invest in? Like a grassland protection co-op, some entity that's made up of producers who are running cattle and private landowners who help to sort of coordinate a local cattle producer doing a spot mob graze on a restored prairie and getting the cattle off and going to the next place while that landscape is rested, while the pasture landscape is rested. So a couple of last slides here. We know that if we have multi-layered disturbance regimes, we're going to be really increasing our ecological outputs, biodiversity. We know that if we have cattle grazing, then there is a profit margin available. And we know that that can be a disturbance and that profit margin can help with the land resiliency, and both ecologically as well as from an economic standpoint. We also, so when we think about achieving that stage level, we're talking about the functional stage of all prairie, non-prairie grasslands, right? And so we can zero in at a small section or a couple of sections of Guthrie County, but that quickly can expand to a much larger area if we have this multi-level disturbance pattern taking place on private lands and individuals working together. So a couple of take-home messages. This opportunity exists. We can protect the grassland stage if we are working together in some way, producer, non-producer, prairie, and we're thinking about this landscape as a whole. We know that climate change is real, it is here, and it is a destabilizing piece of that we're going to have to deal with. And so if we want to protect the stage of grassland, we're going to have to think more than just our 40-acre restored prairie and how healthy it is. We're going to have to think of what's happening on the neighbor's pasture land, right, in order to save the stage. Basically part of the multi-disturbance regime in Iowa is productivity. We're going to have to think about that economically and ecologically. How do we protect landscape that doesn't really have that economic return that most Iowans expect? So I think in the future, this is a reality. This is an absolute reality. Okay, not much time left for questions, but I would happily entertain questions if you like, and maybe I'll turn this camera on and back over to you.
Plenty of time for questions, Tolif, no problem at all. Folks will stay on or they'll hop off if they need to after the lunch hour here, but at any rate, we'll have these questions recorded. So let's start with a couple of the first ones here. Oh, this is an interesting one. Your thoughts on how might wind farms impact sustainability and resiliency? When the farm is retired, the above ground materials are removed, but there is no requirement to remove the below ground structures. Just installing a tower is incredibly disruptive, not just the tower, but the access roads and area, so on and so forth. A little outside of maybe the realm of prairies, but any thoughts on that? Or?
Yeah, I think that this is one of those things, and I really appreciate the viewer for bringing this up. This is something that one of those impacts that I completely left off that we have to take into consideration. these are having a huge impact and footprint on our landscape. And I tell you, it's not something I've dug into, but even just the roads that are approaching for maintenance are dissecting this grassland landscape in a big way. It's sort of, you can grow things underneath it, right? An extent, so you can have prairie underneath these towers, but the impact is huge. And I don't have a great answer, except for we probably need to push the industry to focus on deconstruction levels, much like a Superfund cleanup requirement or something along those lines.
Understood. So I'm curious about the grazing aspect. We know that there's cattle grazing. Can sheep be a replacement for cattle grazing? Any thoughts on that?
Boy, I tell you, yes, the sheep could absolutely serve in that same role. Sheep typically graze differently than cattle, and they typically graze much closer to the ground. So it might depend on the management desires. So that might be a beneficial type of grazing. And if sheep are in a high enough density, they will pretty much pick a landscape clean. That might be beneficial in some cases if you're dealing with a particular weed that you want to get rid of or something like that. But so a little bit different grazing style between sheep and cattle. But yes, absolutely, they could serve in that role.
Great, great. A climate change question here. Is the current rate of climate change statistically higher than, say, the most recent 4 to 5 climate change periods at the same point in the climate change cycle? Well, you're probably not a climate scientist, but any thoughts?
Yeah, the rate of change is much accelerated. And I think what is most nerve-wracking is what we know the rate of change will accelerate even more because of the carbon loading that we've had. And so while you might look back at different periods of climate change and they might compare closely, we know that the carbon load in our atmosphere is going to continue to accelerate that change. And so that's why I think this is a different scenario than what we've ever had.
Well, I certainly appreciate the focus on grazing because it's so important because of the integrative system and the way that it can distribute the manure, and it can, and as a management technique, it does a lot of good work there. Oh, so along those same lines, where does haying fit into the prairie pasture management?
Hey, that's a great question. Another one of those land management tools that I did not place up there. So haying, I think, has a role on that landscape. Generally speaking, if you can keep it in an enclosed system, so keep that hay from being shipped off to, say, Nebraska or some other part of the world, I think that haying is a viable option for some grasslands, right? And even for certain restored prairies. I think the only issue is that that carbon and that biomass export element of haying. It makes it a kind of, what did Cookie Monster say? A sometimes kind of treat, right? So haying might be an option, particularly if you have a weed issue or if you are way behind and you needed to graze, but you can't get the graze in there, and haying is an option. I think that is one of those tools that can be a viable tool, but we've got to be careful with it because of the biomass and carbon export.
Oh, hey, Denise wants to know about honeybees. How might honeybees be incorporated or used?
Oh, and
pollinators in general.
Pollinators in general. I think pollinators are one of those species that are on the list of why we create and think about setting the stage, right? Pollinators are, I think, extremely sensitive to climate change, extremely sensitive to species composition. And the more fragmented the landscape is, the more difficult time pollinators have. Honeybees, I think, could be a huge part of that pollination scenario, particularly when we think about adding productivity to the landscape. So, and I'm thinking along the lines of restoring the resilience of pasture, give it a long rest. If that were, combined with, honeybees and maybe another disturbance type of fire or something like that, that landscape would benefit tremendously. But I love the idea of honeybees as one of those options, maybe not grazing, maybe you combine it with honey production. I mean, that is economic value, absolutely.
Great. One last question here. How can farmers be encouraged to convert grass waterways to more than grass? I've noticed several that are filled with non-native plants, in fact.
Yeah, there are programs, farm bill programs that are promoting more diverse grass waterways. They are typically a little bit more difficult to establish, but their maintenance has proven over time to be potential. I think that grass waterways in that cropland setting, the best way is to incentivize it through some of those farm bill types of programs or conservation district programs. The issue we run into is, many of the grass waterways are used for baling hay, and there's uncertainty in whether or not you can continuously do that and maintain it if you've got a more diverse grass waterway. There is quite a number of programs out there, these natural strips programs. I would definitely look into that. But I think incentivizing with funds and better management options for the producer are a couple of potential ways we could maybe move the needle towards something a little bit more diverse, or maybe a little less filled with things like thistle and other kind of non-desirable types of species.
Perfect. Tolif, boy, this has been a great presentation. I cannot thank you enough. We got some great questions from folks. This has all been recorded. This will be posted on our YouTube page in just a couple of days. Round of applause. Thank you, Tolif, and everyone else. Have a great day. We'll see you on the 27th for the last glacier in Iowa. Take care, everyone.
Thanks so much, Jeff. Thanks, everyone.